Hello everyone, this is Raj here, and this is the second part in the series how I created the game engine from scratch. So if you haven't watched the first part where I created the initial code for GameObject, transform and all sort of stuff, please watch it first and continue with the second part. So let's begin. So we are in the Visual Studio Code here, and we will be continuing with the previous code where I coded the game object and abstract game object and also its property called transform. So here we are just creating a simple 2D game engine which will have a minimal sort of thing that will be helpful for creating games. So we are going to create a scene first of all, because you can think of a scene as a level in a game, and a level holds all the game objects that are currently active on your screen. So first of all we will create a scene file here, scene.py. Then I'm just calling uh, name it a scene. And first of all we want an active scene static property here. So you can think of it as when a game runs there will be only single active level at a time. So active levels are responsible for holding all the active game objects right now which are displaying on your screen. So we will hold all the active game objects in a static variable or a static property of this scene in active scene. So don't forget to add the t here, and we will just initialize with none. And after that we are going to create a constructor for it, and we want the initial game objects for this scene, so we can take a list of game objects. So I will just name them list, a game object and list. And after that I will just create width, and we will just start with 600 and by 600. So we are also holding the values of width and height of the window for the current game. You can save this in another class or so, but I don't think that for our 2D game engine we need that much of classes. So we are just going to use the simple width and height property for the current scene. And after that I'm just going to define some of the private members to this. For example, there is a new object class, new object property. So for example, there is new objects and there are active objects. For example, in a scene you just generating some of the objects like bullets. For example, a user is firing some of the bullets toward the enemy, then these bullets are not part of the current game loop. For example, then on every game iteration there are certain game objects for that current frame. So if the bullet is not part of the current frame, then it will be added in the next frame. So new objects are the game objects which will be added into the next frame of this game loop of the currently running scene, to be more specific. Then there will be an active objects for the objects which are currently running on your current screen or the current level. And then we will just define some of the properties of width, and we will just mark it with width. Self dot height will be height, and then we will move to defining some of the getters here. For example, I will just mark it with self, and then it will just return the self dot height here, and just mark it with or enclose it with the property decorator so that it can become a getter to this class. Then we will define the width getter here. Then after that I will just return self dot width here. Then on the top I will just enclose it with the property. Then after that I want some of the static methods so that I can add or remove objects to the current scene. So we want a class method first of all that will be we can name it as add to active scene, which will get a class and a current game object, and we will name it a class method. Then the first thing that it will try, it will check whether the active scene can be, whether the active scene is available or not. Because if active scene is not available and we are going to add the game object to the active scene, then it's going to cause an error. uh, for example, let me just write self dot, oh sorry, self class dot active scene dot, just name it load game object. We haven't defined the game object, we will define it later in this, after this, which will just going to add the passed game object to the active scenes so that it can be generated into the next frame. And then if the active scene is none, as you can see above here, if the active scene is none, then load game object will cause an attribute error. So we are just going to catch that error, attribute here, attribute error here. And then if it causes that, we are just going to call, or we are just going to print that no active scene available. Okay, so we have done with it. Then the next part will be load game object. So the load game object will not have much of logic here. It will just load or add the past game object to the set of new object. So we will just name it load game objects, or the game object here, which will have a self and a game object passed to it. Then we will move to self dot new objects dot add, because that's a set, we can just add this game object. Then after that we are going to add some of our more methods, for example like accessing the current game scene, because you can see that the active game scene is a private static property of this class. So just name it get active scene here. We are just going to pass the class here, and we are going to return out the class dot active scene, and we will class method. We are just going to decorate with class method because we are accessing the class here, the currently active class here. And after we just coded the load game object, we are just going to define some of the more methods here. For example, we can add remove game object. So this method will be used for deleting the object from the current scene. For example, if you destroy a game object in a particular frame and you want that object to be deleted in the next frame, you are going to use this because all the game objects are part of that current scene. So we are just going to call self dot, this will be active objects dot remove. Then we are going to call the game object into it. Then it will just remove the currently or the past game object if it is available in the current active game objects. So we need another method called activate here, because if we want to deactivate other scenes and we want to activate this scene, then we need activate. And this will be a simple method which is just going to and just mark it with scene dot active scene equals to self. So it will save the static value of the active scene with self. For this will change the active scene and you will get the next level in your game. So the next method we want to add it to it is get game objects. So since we have already defined here that active object is a private member to this class, so we want to access those. So we are just going to create a getter here again, but this will be a class method because we want to access it without using the object. So just name it class dot active scene, and we just going to code the get active methods, get active game object below. Name it get active game object, which is going to take this self, and it is just going to return the active member of, or the active objects set, so that we can access the currently active game objects which are part of this scene. So we have defined some of the methods for this scene. First of all, we defined the static property of this scene called the active scene, then which overrided the constructor of this class, that is init. We want the initial game object that are going to be part of this scene. Then there will be width and height of the scene. These are the part of the window property of your game engine. But since we are not going to create a window because we are not creating any complicated game engine, we are just going to store it in the scene. Then the next part will be initializing the new object, which is going to hold the all the objects which are going to be part of the next frame. Then there will be active objects which are part of the currently active scene. Then we are just going to pass the width and height property to this scene so that we can access them later. Then we define the getter for the height and width. We also define some of the class method here, for example get active scene, which is just going to access the private static property of this scene. Then after that we called add to active scene, which is just going to call the active scene. First of all, it accesses the active scene, then it is going to call the load game object, which is here. It is just going to add the new object to the game object, and after that remove the current. There will be a method called remove game object, which is just going to delete the past game object from the active objects which are part of the currently active game loop. Then there is an activate method which is just going to assign this object to the static property of the scene. Then there is a method called get game objects. This is just going to get the game object from the currently active scene. And there is the get active game object, which is just a getter for the game objects or the active game objects here. There is one more method here, it is, that is called update scene self here first of all, and I will call while loop here, and it will be an infinite while loop. Then I will try first of all, then so that it cannot cause any error. Then I will access the item from the self dot new objects which are going to be part of the next active frame. Then I will just pop from it. Then I will add them to the current active scene dot add them these item here. Then I will catch the key error, where I will just break the loop. And the part of destroying an object is going to be in the, I guess this will be part of the game loop. I guess we can handle it here for sure. I will just name it self dot deleted objects. I will just start with this set. I don't think it will require a set. I will just name it, just initialize with a list. And I will just, after it done with this, I'll just initialize another while loop, and I will try it, and I will access all the deleted item first of all, self dot deleted objects dot pop, so that we can access the all the objects will be removed from the list one by one. and self dot active objects dot remove will be this item, the index error, and when it causes this we are just going to break the loop. So let's continue with defining the game loop here. So I'm just creating a file named game loop. So if you don't know what a game loop is, you should watch the first video where I explained it. So in a short, a game loop is something which iterate over every game object that is available in your active scene, and while doing so it calls some of the methods like input, update and render, and sometimes I also called fixed update if it's in the limited time frame, for example if it is running at 60 fps or not. So I will start by accessing the scene first of all because we need this active scene here. I will just import from dot scene import scene. Then below that I will just create a class called game loop, and it will be a simple class, and I'm defining a constructor here which will hold some of the values like limit frame, because we are just going to use the fixed update part which will just be called every this number of times in a second. For example, if I name fps equals to 60, then the we will try to code something in a way that fixed update will be called 60 times in a frame. Then there will be self dot limit fps, and it will be limit fps. So after defining the constructor, I am thinking of defining a init method for initializing this loop. So it will hold a canvas and a window. So initially I was thinking of defining just a terminal for accessing the terminal, and then we are just going done with it. But later I understand that terminal cannot run at 60 fps if we don't use the pywin library and access all the buffer and sort of stuff, and it will cause a unnecessary complication into our library. So we are just going to use the tinker library or tkinter, I don't know what to say about it, and just name started with none. Initially we are just going to create a game in terminal in this game engine for just to check whether our game engine is working or not. Then after the first step will be for the time being I'm just going to start the start game loop method. Game loop method, and since it is not part of our current game loop or it's not part of our current class, we will just going to get the error, and I'm not getting error, I haven't saved it. So let's start with start game loop. It will be self. Then the first step will be accessing the all the active objects. So I will just name it scene equals to scene dot get active scene. Then I will access game objects. Let's just name this game scene equal to game objects active scene. Then get game objects, and these are all the active game objects that are currently on the active scene or are available to the active scene. Then since we have also defined the started property here, and initially all the game objects will not be started or are not part of the started loop, so we are just going to mark them first of all, they are started before starting the loop. So we access all the game objects, then we are just going to iterate over them. I am just going to name them go in game objects, then go dot start. I guess I have defined a method to start it. I'm just going to start here, and I will just call them start, and then after that I will just move down and I will define a while loop, which is just going to run for infinite number of times. So this is where our game loop begins. So I will just mark it with game loop. So as we discussed, the game loop is something which access all the game objects that are present in the current scene. So we are just going to access all the game objects first of all that are available in the current game scene on every iteration. So I just mark them or just call the same method like above here. Then after that I will just go down, and after accessing all the game objects I'm just going to iterate over all the game objects here for geo in game objects like the above. And while accessing them or while iterating them, I will first of all check whether the game object is started or not, because if it is not started then they are not part of the current scene, or they are not visible in to the current scene. So if item dot started, let me check whether I've defined it as property. Yeah, they are the public properties. Started, if they are not started, I'm just going to mark them started. So I will just say if geo is go, not item. If they are not started, then I will just going to start them first of all, then start. This can happen if the game object is not part of the previous frame but it is part of the current frame. Then we will go down, and after starting all the objects, start game objects. Then after that I will just go down and check whether the game object is destroyed or not, as we have defined here that if game object is destroyed then this flag will be true. So I will go down, and if geo dot destroyed, then we are going to call the scene dot remove game object here, and I will just pass, since this is going to be a class property, not the property of the class, it is going to be property of the object. So we are going to access the get active scene first of all, then we are going to call remove game object, which will add them to the destroyed or the deleted object list here, so that we can delete them into the next frame. So if the game object is marked as destroyed, we are just going to add them to the list. So we are just going to add them here, and after that if the game object is started and also it is not destroyed, then we are just going to handle the input first of all, as we have discussed in the part 1, that the game loop will continue to loop through all the game objects while calling the input or handle input. Then after that it will handle the update and go dot update. We will handle fix update when we define the time delta function, which will be the part of the second or the third part in this series. So wait for it, but initially we don't need it, so we will just going to call the game go dot update. So after the go dot update, we are just going to call handle render. So go dot render. This is all a game loop does. It iterate over all the game objects in the current scene, then it just call these three methods. And once I call the render method, I think that is all. But there is one more thing, because we are adding the game, or there are adding the game object to the remove game list and also starting it. And there will be sometimes when we generate game objects which will going to be part of the currently active scene. So we want to update the scene every time. So I will just go here and see scene dot update scene. And since it is also a object property, so I will just first of all get the get active scene, and then I will call update scene, so that it will remove all the destroyed object from the active scene, and also add all the newly generated objects to the active scene, so that it can be rendered in the next game loop. So I'm not going to add it here, I should be adding it here, because it is going to access every time. So I will just comment it out, update scene objects, then I will just comment it out, access all the active objects in the active scene. Then below it I will just comment out as call for every game object in the current scene. And that is all for this tutorial, and I will see you in the next tutorial. So stay tuned and be subscribed to this channel, and also press that bell button if you want to get latest notification on this series, and also comment down if you have any problem in it. So thank you.